Limbus Company, like every other game ever made, has had a ton of content and ideas that never made it into the finished product. I thought it'd be interesting to go and look through the content that never was, and maybe bring in some new discussion about what's left on the cutting room floor. But first, a couple of disclaimers. 1. This video is about content that never made it into the game. I'm going to be focusing on talking about things that were never explicitly added into Limbus Company, so things like older mirror dungeons or the Arknights collab are not going to be mentioned. 2. This video will contain a lot of speculation. Because there isn't an official source on a lot of this material, there's no commentary to go along with it, so I'm going to have to make a lot of my own guesses into why things weren't added and what they were going to do. So take a lot of what I say as an opinion, not fact. 3. I won't be mentioning everything. There's a lot of small things you will see later in the video that I didn't have time to mention, so if there's something you think that should be talked about, please put it in the comments. 4. This video will contain spoilers about Limbus and the rest of Project Moon's games. The sources I use for this video are the cutting room floor, the Limbus Company Wiki, the data mining channel, the Project Moon Community Hub, and Project Moon's YouTube channel. So if there isn't something in this video, it's likely because it wasn't mentioned or documented there. Anyway, let's begin, starting with unused game mechanics. Both the things I'm about to mention are actually used to some extent in Limbus, but only in the game's code. The first cut thing I'm going to mention is multiplication coins, which work exactly how you think they would. They multiply whatever the current skill power is by the amount on the coin. There is footage of them existing in one of the old gameplay demonstrations, and they actually are fully functional in-game, but no skill currently uses them. They even have status effects associated with them. They're also the entire reason why base and final power are different effects to begin with. These are pretty obviously scrapped for balancing reasons, especially with how easy it is to spread effects like attack power-up. So the only way these can work in Modern Limbus is some sort of restriction on the skill itself. Even with 1 base power on a 4 coin skill with 2 coin power, you'd roll a 16. And with 1 more coin power, it would be an 81. Yeah, imagine how broken this would be in Mirror Dungeon. There exists references to 2 set infinities called Madness and Angst, each associated with the colors black and white respectively in the game files. These must have been cut pretty early because there's no gameplay footage of them in the betas, but what's interesting about these is they're actually used in the story with certain abnormality cores containing black and white gems, though this could be related to something else entirely. If I had to guess what they would do, I'd imagine they would act similar to Almighty damage in Persona or Pale damage in LobCorp, where it's a damage type that's very difficult to resist and enemies are often weak to it. If I had to guess why they were cut, likely for story reasons or just not to bloat the total amount of infinities already present. Moving on to concept/cut art, we first have a lot of concept art to sift through. Starting with an early version of Ardor Blossom star Ishmael and a scratch Marsault ego, Ishmael has a widely different art style here compared to how she looks in the final game, though the overall ego art is pretty close to how it works in-game with a few small tweaks. Marsault's scrapped ego for the hole in a man abnormality doesn't have a full ego art at all, and fearing this was probably not too far into development. It's a shame because this abnormal looks like it fits Marsault like a glove. I hope this ego comes back as a Battle Pass ego sometime. Next is some concept art for 4th match frame Ryoshu, which seems to be just for general design instead of anything meant to be used in game. There aren't too many differences in the concept art between the final release, which is interesting, but it is really cool being able to see Ryoshu from the front like this. Moving on to concept art for Headless Ichthys and Alloy Watchdog, Fish McGee seems to got no big changes aside from some coloring, though on the right side of the page I'm unsure if that's supposed to be what they originally looked like or something else entirely. So maybe Fish McGee went through some big changes and I don't know because I can't read Korean. Alleyway Watchdog actually does have a couple big changes from release, mainly making the body tied to the wolf more prevalent, with some sketches ditching the wolf heads entirely. There's also some wire on the front legs of the wolf here, and the power lines appear to have some more details on them, which is very interesting. Last but not least for concept art, we have some sketches for Diviat North and Zwylast Fixer shown off in one of Project Moon's live streams. There's nothing too crazy here, mainly some experiments with colors and gear location, but one thing worth noting is how both of these sketches with Zwylast Fixer later got combined and used as Paula's design in Kanto 7, which is really... Moving on from concept art is a lot of unused/promotional art from Limbus Company's website, some of which can still be seen on the site itself or on the Wayback Machine. I won't note everything from the website in this section because a lot of it goes into other categories, but trust me when I say there's a ton here. First is an early sketch of Liu Hongwu wielding a sword. He looks to be facing off against some knight-looking people with horns. Nothing too crazy, but it's still interesting to see how the ID arts have developed over time. And seeing the Liu use swords this early is really interesting. Next is some early versions of KK Ryoshu and Rodian's arts. Ryoshu doesn't have too much different other than some shading and coloring that I honestly prefer more than what we got in the final game. But KK Radiance is interesting because instead of Hongwu, like how it is in the final version, it's Yi Sang instead. There's actually a lot of evidence that some members of the Blade lineage and the Kurokuma clan were supposed to be swapped, so it's interesting to see drawings of it actually happening. Next up is this image of Dante sitting up with completely different claw hand positions than what we got in the final game. Not gonna lie, this is cursed as hell, but I am curious to see if the claw hands were supposed to mean something different, or what we got in the final game was a late addition. Moving on to another cut ego, we have art of a cut 4th match flame ego. It's kinda hard to tell who it's supposed to be, it's either Don or Sinclair, which isn't too surprising because that ego can fit a lot of sinners thematically. Kinda a bummer we never got this because having 4 4th match flame egos sounds really funny. There's also some neat art of D-Corp in the forest surrounding it, which we see in the prologue. I wish we actually got this in game because I would love to see a lot more about D-Corp in the final version, and we never really got that, at least in the early parts of Limbus Company. There's another early Ryu art with Leo Gregor who is holding a sword. Most notably in this art, Gregor has his full hand instead of a prosthetic one like he has in the final game. This was probably made before they decided that most Gregor entities should also have a missing arm, and there's also a ton of other small differences in this art, but I'm not going to list every single one here. Moving on to another piece of Gregor art, we can see his aforementioned old Leo ID art and art for a Rhino Gregor. Yep, that's right, Gregor was supposed to get a 3-star Rhino ID at some point in time, but for some reason they ended up scrapping him. Rhino Gregor likely didn't get too far into development as there's no video footage or sprite sheets involving him actually in action, but based on the support passive name, he was likely a tank ID. If I had to guess his ultimate fate, he likely got reworked into either Zwei Gregor or Rhino Mersault, but I am just speculating here. Kind of unfortunate they ended up cutting him. Next up are some placeholders, which are very common in basically every game ever mate's development, basically just serving as temporary assets until the full art is finally finished. First, we have some placeholders for items such as Lunacy and Keflin boxes and extraction tickets, all with some placeholder text on them. These are all pretty funny and obviously pretty low quality. There's also some placeholder portraits for every single sinner except Dante, all of them drawn in a very dumbed down art style that is just really funny to me for some reason. Like, why is Mersault so angry? There exists some early art for the speech bubbles listeners will occasionally use when talking in the main story cutscenes. There isn't too much notable here, and the early ones look fine, so I'm curious to know why they felt like they needed to make new ones, especially since there wasn't really anything wrong with the old ones. Maybe art style consistency? I don't know. Some differently colored ego risk levels exist in the game files for the ego UI in the center screen, and they are in line with how the enemy's risk levels are colored, but they're used for egos instead. If I had to guess why they didn't go through with adding the colors, is maybe to prevent confusion for either the sin affinities or traditional rarities in games, because risk levels doesn't necessarily equal the rarity or how good an ego is. A lot of major story characters have unused death sprites associated with them, even ones who did end up living through their enemy encounters and died in cutscenes. If I had to guess why these exist, they might have just existed just in case they ended up making any adjustments to the story, or were just intended for mirror dungeon encounters and they found it easier to not use them at the end of the day. For some bizarre reason, 70 Sang has an unused battle sprite with some different colors and shading more akin to the ones seen in the 7 Association fixtures seen in the Library of Runa. I have no idea why they even bothered with changing his colors. The only guess I have is they just wanted him to be more colorful, but I honestly have zero idea. There exists a ton of art for the game's story that was never used. Some because they were just early versions that were never meant to be used in the first place, while others were seemingly cut for no reason. Starting with the CG that doesn't seem to be based off any particular canto, it might have just been one for testing. I could see this maybe being a Canto 2 CG, but that feels like a stretch. After that are some early versions of the pass-on CGs seen in the endings of the first 3 cantos. Nothing too notable here, they're just significantly less detailed from the final versions. After that are some early Canto 2 piece of art, with the first one being the CG where the sinners are being asked to dance, but this time they have their gambling outfits on instead of the LCB ones like how it is in the final game. Next, Canto 2 art is an early version of the background scene in the top floor gambling den, with this version lacking the elevator in the very back. After that are some CGs that were actually used, but only in the theater and are likely bugs, since most of them did get removed. Canto 7 has a different CG with the fixers are discussing their plans, with this version not having Hugo and Hongwu just randomly being really angry for some reason. You can actually still see this one in-game unlike the others I'm about to mention, which is interesting. Canto 9 quite famously had a ton of these early CGs on launch and were later removed. Honestly, most of these don't have anything too big about them and probably were just changed for consistency and presentation purposes. Following all that are some twinning thread CGs, and there are a surprising amount of these. Most of these are just images of the city that never got used, which is a little disappointing because they had a lot of great atmosphere and do a lot of good world building. The rest just seem to be for extended or cut sequences that never occurred. Again, shame because they look really good. Another 4th match flame related unused art is this unused background for a 4th match flame ego. It does have the same general idea as the other 2 ego backgrounds, like the birds in the background or there being some debris on the ground. It's done in a completely different art style, and the buildings in the background are also completely different from the final version. I imagine this got cut pretty early on. Dongling, Dom, Beck, and Cassetti all have some slightly different sprite sheets with different designs, mainly showing off their face a lot more. What makes Cassetti's in particular strange is that since his mask is sewn onto his face, he can't take it off, so I have no idea why this sprite even exists of him. Rian also has some different sprites with his mask, which has this mask with a black eye on it instead of it just being fully white like how it is in the final game. No idea why they ended up changing this, maybe because the final version just looked better. There's a surprising amount of art that exists for several cut ego gifts, both in and out of Mirror Dungeon, with quite a few existing for the Canto 2 and Canto 3 abnormalities. These were probably cut because both these dungeons already have a lot of gifts, so needing to add more events in order for them to be used would have just been unnecessary. On top of those story gifts, there's also some cut ego gifts in Mirror Dungeon, with one being based off Screaming Electric Sheep. What's interesting about this ego gift in particular is that it was added in the Hatred and Despair update instead of being introduced with the railway theme packs like what you'd expect. There's also a cut Time Killing Time Botgag ego gift that was possibly meant to be a fusion. If I had to guess why it was cut, it might have just been the fact that Trevor was already really good in Mirror Dungeon, and more fusion gifts might have just been unnecessary, or maybe it was just simply time restraints. I have no idea. In one of the very first builds of the Limbus Company website, one of the few things that you're able to see is a small mock-up of what the drive screen would have looked like in the art style of the first 4 cantos, which is really cool. I'm a pretty big fan of this mock-up, but there's a certain charm to Limbus's current menu and UI scheme that's kind of impossible to match, and I can see why they ended up going with that. When AMD was switching to the theme pack system, originally all the theme packs were going to use the silhouette style that most of the theme packs currently use. These unused silhouettes also clue us into some possible changes that were going to be done, such as Spicebush being a Phosphor nest workshop in technology, and Gasarpoo not being present for the Canto 5 theme pack. Another interesting thing is that the Canto 4 pack doesn't have Dongling who denies all, despite him being shown off in the trailer for MD4. So it was likely that this idea for all the theme packs to have silhouettes got cut pretty early. There are some more unused CGs, with this time existing for Canto 1, with some pretty small differences, so I didn't mention them in the other section. The first CG doesn't have too much different, just Ryoshu having a name tag, and her name being spelled differently for some reason, and the final CG has Yuri's eye actually being present instead of an eye patch, which is a pretty interesting design change. Moving on to a lot of early builds / mockups for Limbus Company, there are a surprising amount of them that show off various ideas for the game and what it was going to be, starting with probably the most infamous one. If you've been in the Limbus Company community long enough, there's a pretty good chance you've seen this image floating around the internet, with the centers facing off against 3 distorted black silences, and the background of King and Greed from Library of Runa. There's a ton to unpack with this image, but first we can see a lot of UI elements and core gameplay was decided on pretty early. Next up, every center uses very early sprites and art, with some not even having their weapons yet. We can also see a turn order system on the top left of the screen, which I would try to guess is how it's supposed to function, but I honestly have no idea. It's that crazy. It's also notable that every center has very early art here with some big differences. One big one here being Dawn having red eyes instead of her normal ones. Looking over the dashboard, its overall aesthetic is pretty much the same, but one notable difference is the inclusion of the LopCorp damage types instead of the Runa ones, with the colors being the damage type in the icon and the dashboard being the Sin Affinity, I guess, since the icons also seen in the top right are in a vein similar to how the Ego Resources UI works today. Again, this is a pretty insane image, and I probably didn't even cover everything here without realizing it. After that bombshell of a mockup, we have this early gotcha mockup with one key thing of note. Liu Gregor being a 3-star instead of a 2-star like how he is in the final game. Now, there are a lot of pre-release adjustments to rarity, but hear me out when I say that I actually do think Liu Gregor was supposed to be a 3-star and this wasn't just some placeholder. Because in all the beta footage for Limbus Company, we don't see what would end up being Gregor's actual 3-star, which was G Corp Gregor. And despite there being 2 Liu IDs at launch, none of them were 3-stars. G Corp Gregor probably ended up happening late into development, and they just gave him the 3-star rarity because he was cooler and had a more unique gimmick. But again, this is just speculation. Next is another version of the drive skin, with this time it looking much similar to how it is in the final game. The only big thing to note here is the lack of all the side modes, as they were instead replaced with this humorous message referencing ham ham pang pang. The identity/ego selection screen also has a mock-up version, with the screenshot only showing off the ego screen. What's interesting here is that the only ego shown off is displayed like an ID, completed with a 2-star rarity and everything. I have to assume these are just placeholders while they were still getting the ego screen nailed down, but it's still interesting nonetheless. A mockup for the window screen also exists and probably has the least amount of changes out of any of the screens we've seen so far. The only real big difference here is that some centers don't have their center icons yet, which is interesting. This either means they didn't have them finished or their center number was still up in the air. Oddly enough, out of all the centers on the right, Sinclair is the only one with a center icon, so I guess they figured him out pretty early on. I'm curious to know if there's any lore implications with that. The last mock-up here is a mock-up for what story dungeons were supposed to look like, and you can see some pretty big differences here, with what seems to be a health bar in the top left and a die roll mechanic. It also seems that you need to pick up objects around the dungeon like keys and use them in various doors and events. There's also a slightly modified Canto 1 background here, which is interesting. I don't see why they needed to do that. I'm kinda glad they didn't go through with this because this looks really convoluted. It may have just been frustrating for noob. The next big thing to mention are the videos of Limbus Company's development posted on Project Moon's YouTube channel. Now, when I say basically everything was different, I really mean it, and that's why I won't be going over certain things mentioned on screen for the sake of time, and so I also don't repeat myself. But the footage does speak for itself a lot of the time, and if you do want to watch these, they're still up on Project Moon's YouTube channel. First big thing to note is the use of Library of Runa icons in place of the finalized Limbus Company ones in a lot of areas, especially since a lot of them don't even make sense in a lot of places, but it's still interesting to see them use these. Another thing to note that you may notice is that when starting a turn, where the battle is actually happening is also listed, which is kind of interesting. But it doesn't really add a whole lot, since if you just pay attention to the story, you should know where you are, so that's probably why they scrapped it. Moving on to some localization differences, first small thing to note is attack powerdown being labeled as weak, similar how Runa labels its status effects. I think a lot of the later name changes are actually pretty good, because it makes things way easier to understand. After that are passives, starting with 7 Use Sang. Acute Studies was named Keen Sense. W. Corphouse's Self-Charging was named Discharge. KK Rodian's Dark Cloud Blade was named Swirling Clouds. Shi Heathcliff's Respiration was named Violent Fury. KK Ryoshu Muscle and Charge was named Dark Cloud Storm. W. Corp Mersault Tactiturn was named Electrical Burn. Liu Honglu Isn't It Warmed was named Charm. Equip Ishmael's Tenacity was named Brainwave Disruption. Blade Lineage Sinclair's Bloody Hands was named Perfect Formation. Blade Lineage Otis's Double Tap was named Life on the Line, and that's all I could discern in terms of name changes. 7 Use Sang actually had a unique special status effect called the Taunted, which seems to use the fear icon from Lobotomy Corporation. Due to the low quality of the footage and lack of detail, I have no idea what it actually does, but if I had to guess, it probably does something similar to the Agitated Panic effect, just going by the name. Shi Heathcliff has, I think, the only case of having a straight up different coin amount on a skill, and thus different animations. In this case, his skill 3, which is incredibly interesting. It's also worth noting that his skill 3 has a unique targeting conditional with it targeting the 2 units in front, which is something never seen in any other skill in the game. Some egos do target the rearmost unit, but that's about it in terms of unique targeting based on the location of the enemy. One thing you may notice in this footage is that during combat, this little bar with the Limbus Company logo moves depending on what's currently happening, with it moving further right when enemies get hurt and moving left when allies get hurt. And this bar determines what side is currently winning the battle. Runa actually has something pretty similar to this, and that's probably why this mechanic was brought over to Limbus Company, but it ended up getting scrapped. But not entirely, because only the visual indicator got scrapped. Which side is winning does actually still exist in the game, and it determines what music plays in on focus encounters, which is why the music sometimes randomly changes when playing them. In some gameplay footage, Gloom is replaced with Greed, which is in line with the traditional 7 deadly sins. This was likely changed later on just because Greed and Gluttony are pretty similar thematically, and adding Gloom makes a lot of sense for the sinking status and the game's themes, and it helps enhance the story massively. And that concludes this section about the Limbus Company betas that exist on Project Moon's YouTube channel. Again, if you want to watch these are still currently up, and there's a lot more that I didn't mention here that was just way too minor. Now moving on to gameplay changes. In Limbus Company, every enemy has a unique ID in the game's code, but there's a ton of unused ones, and I want to go over the more interesting ones because they reveal some pretty interesting stuff about this game's development history. Most of the unused IDs are actually not that interesting and usually end up being things like unfocused versions of focused-only enemies and vice versa, so I won't be going over things like that. There's an early version of the easy Papa Bongi fight where he has an adjusted skill set that makes him a lot easier to deal with. This ended up getting replaced with just his normal boss fight, with just reduced HP and a unique status effect, and I have zero idea why they even bothered making this version if that's just what they ended up going with. The Ring researchers in Canto 6 actually have another variant where they're labeled as actual OV fixers and have completely different names and sin affinities for all of their skills. It's interesting because when we fight them in the story, they're already revealed as fake, so there wasn't any reason for these to exist in the first place. This could hint at some possible story changes, but I'm unsure. Sunshine Dawnbag actually has a lot of unused Mirror Dungeon data ever since Mirror Dungeon 3, and another unused version existing since MD4 that was meant to act as a first phase of sorts for the Spice Bush Dawnbag fight, but due to a bug it's never seen and they've never bothered patching it, likely to not disrupt pacing with the current MD at the time. The first Queepeg fight actually has a variant for both Mirror Dungeon and Railway 3, which is interesting. These are both probably scrapped because the fight is really easy and it wouldn't really add anything of note to either game mode. And speaking of Railway, there are several more enemies that were supposed to be in Railway, including Donglanger Denies All, Twinrook Pirates, Ring Researchers, Barber, Fanghunt Fixers, and Hohenheim. These were also probably cut for similar reasons, mainly just not adding anything to the Railway, since there are pretty easy fights and are not very interesting mechanically. Some Battle Pass egos actually had different risk levels before they were launched and added to the game. I will have the changes displayed on screen because going into each one individually would take a while, but it's still interesting to see that these were subject to debate. But when I think about it, I can kinda see why these were originally considered, seeing the finalized version of each of these egos. This next section will be quite short, but there's a ton of unused voice lines for various IDs throughout the game. Mostly just variants of pre-existing lines, so I won't be going over them. But the first set of voice lines I do want to point out are on Spice Bushy Sang, who has unused voice lines for increasing and decreasing sanity that no other ID in the game has.
꽃내음이 더욱 달크나오. 그 어느 때보다 정신이 활짝 피어나는 것 같구려. 흙을 덮어야 해.
Similar lines and scripts also exist for Sunshower Heathcliff and Sloshing Ishmael, but also went unused. And that's likely because around the time these were added, there were some planned changes to the SP system that never got added. And that's what these lines probably correlate to. And since these changes never happened, there was no reason to include these lines. Another interesting unused voice line is on Butler Ryoshu that was meant to play under certain conditions, presumably against Wild Hunt enemies.
이거 완전 호랑이 새끼를.
Why this went unused, I have no idea, because it's pretty cool. And speaking of special interaction voice lines, Manager Dawn has one for fighting only the priest. The thing is, there's no fight in the game with just him as an enemy, so this goes completely unused.
그 상처들. 이곳의 신부도 자신을 탓하는 건 똑같나?
Shame this got cut because this adds some pretty fun lore to the priest. Last thing I want to mention has to do with the game's lore and story, and the only thing I have here has to do with the Pink Shoes abnormality. There's an observation log for one of the Pink Shoes enemies in Canto 9. It is actually used in-game, but because you can't fight them in a focus encounter, you can never actually see this log in-game. If you want a better look at it, I would recommend checking out the Limbus Company wiki because it has it and all other observation logs documented there. And that finally concludes this video about Limbus Company's cut and unused content. I originally just wanted to make this video because I thought it'd be interesting, and while researching I realized how poorly documented a lot of this stuff is, and I wouldn't be surprised if this video has a few errors or I missed something because of it. But I hope what I did find can serve as a good hub for the subject if anyone is interested, and if I did miss something or more stuff comes to light in the future, I might end up making a follow-up video. If you're interested in that, I would recommend subscribing and turning on notifications so you won't miss it. Anyways, thanks for watching.